Hello there, enthusiasts. Vance here. For the past few videos, we've been exploring how Japan helped shape modern car culture. The tuning shops, the street philosophy, the idea that cars could evolve outside of manufacturers. But the more you zoom out, the more you realize something interesting. Japan was only one half of the story. Because while enthusiasts were rewriting the rules on mountain roads and in garages, manufacturers across the world were doing something else entirely. They weren't reacting to car culture, they were trying to define the future of it. Not next year's model, not the next generation, the future. And for a brief moment in automotive history, that future looked completely unhinged. This is where things get interesting. Because in that era, car companies stopped behaving like companies and started behaving like science fiction writers. And the results were some of the most ambitious machines ever imagined. The Ford GT90, the Volkswagen W12 Nardo, Mercedes Vision SLR, Cadillac 16, and decades later, a car like the Audi Nuvolari. At first glance, they don't belong in the same story. Different countries, different philosophies, different intentions. But the deeper you go, the more you realize something strange. They were all answering the same question: what will the ultimate car look like? And more importantly, what happens when every manufacturer tries to answer it at the same time? The late 1990s and early 2000s were a strange time for the automotive world. The future becomes a competition. The internet was starting to connect everything. Car culture was no longer local. Ideas traveled faster than ever before, and manufacturers suddenly found themselves in an unusual position. They were no longer just competing in sales charts, they were competing in imagination. Because now, a concept unveiled in one country will be seen globally within hours, and that changed everything. A concept car was no longer just a design exercise, it was a statement, a declaration of intent, and sometimes a flex. Because if we could build something outrageous enough, even if it never reached production, it still shaped perception. It still shaped brand identity. And in some cases, it shaped the future itself. This is the environment that produced the first of our machines. Enter the Ford GT90. The Ford GT90 was not subtle. It did not try to be subtle. It looked like something designed by someone who had briefly misunderstood the concept of restraint. Underneath its angular body sat a quad turbocharged V12. Not a V8, not a V10, a V12 with 4 turbochargers. Because apparently, one turbo per bank was considered insufficient optimism. It produced over 700 horsepower at a time when that number still meant something emotional. And visually, it looked like a prototype from a parallel universe where Ford decided, what if we built our own supercar mythology from scratch? The GT90 was not trying to be realistic. It was trying to be a statement, a response to Ferrari, a response to Lamborghini, a response to the idea that Ford could not play in that space. And for a brief moment, it almost felt like they were serious about it. But like many concept cars of its era, it remained exactly that: a concept, a glimpse of a direction the world never fully took. If the Ford GT90 was emotion, the Volkswagen W12 Nardo was engineering obsession. This was not a car built to impress emotionally. It was built to prove something. Powered by a W12 engine, it was part of a larger internal experiment inside Volkswagen Group, a demonstration of what happened when engineering resources were pushed to their logical extreme. It wasn't just about power, it was about endurance, high-speed stability, record attempts. The idea that a road car could behave like a sustained engineering challenge rather than a product. And in many ways, it foreshadowed something larger. Because within the same corporate universe, the idea of extreme engineering will eventually evolve into something far more famous. But at the time, the W12 Nardo stood as a message. We can build this and we can run it at speed for a very long time, which is a very specific kind of threat. The Mercedes Vision SLR concept carried a different tone. It wasn't purely about power, it was about heritage and ambition through motorsport. This was the era where Formula One influence was becoming a design language. Carbon structures, aerodynamic philosophy, performance thinking derived from racing rather than luxury tradition. The Vision SLR represented a bridge between worlds, the racetrack and the boulevard. The idea that performance cars could carry motorsport DNA without apology, and it reflected a deeper shift happening across the industry. Manufacturers were no longer just building fast cars, they were trying to build credibility through racing influence. And in that pursuit, concept cars became the perfect testing ground for identity. Then there was the Cadillac 16, American excess as philosophy, and it needs almost no explanation to understand its intent. It was powered by a V16 engine, not because it needed to be, but because it could be. This was American automotive ambition distilled into one machine. Not efficiency, not restraint, just presence. A statement car in the purest sense. It looked like a return to an era where displacement itself was part of identity. And while it never reached production, it achieved something else. It reminded the world that automotive imagination didn't have to be conservative. It could still be theatrical. At this point, something becomes clear: the invisible connection. These cars were not random experiments, they were part of a shared mindset. A brief moment in automotive history where manufacturers were asking the same question: what happens if we stop thinking about limits for a moment? Different answers, same question. And that's where the real story begins. Because these concepts were not competing against each other, they were competing against the future itself, each one trying to define what performance, luxury, and technology would become. And even though most of them never reached production, their ideas did not disappear. They spread quietly. At some point, the automotive world changed direction. Regulations tightened, development costs increased, market expectations became more conservative, and concept cars began to shift from imagination to preview. They became closer to production reality, less experimental, more controlled. The sharp edges of ambition were softened into something more acceptable. Not worse, just safer. And in that transition, something subtle was lost: the sense that the future could look unfamiliar. And yet, interestingly, many of the ideas from that era eventually returned, not in concept form, but in production reality. 4-digit horsepower is now real. Hybrid performance systems exist across multiple brands. Aerodynamics, once reserved for concepts, now shape road cars. And manufacturers once again compete at the extreme edge of engineering, which leads to a strange realization. The future those concept cars imagined was not wrong, it was just early. And then, decades later, something like the Audi Nuvolari appears, a modern interpretation of ambition, a reminder that even as the industry evolves, the desire to build something extraordinary never fully disappears. But even the name carries a strange weight to it. Nuvolari. It doesn't sound like a trim level or a concept code generated in a design meeting. It sounds like something older than the car itself, something closer to a legacy than a label. And in a way, it is, because in motorsport history, that name belongs to a driver from a time when racing wasn't sanitized, optimized, or controlled by systems. It was instinct, risk, and a willingness to push machinery beyond what it was supposed to tolerate. A mindset the automotive world keeps circling back to, even when everything else becomes more precise, more digital, more calculated. And so when that name reappears here, it doesn't feel decorative, it feels intentional, like a quiet reminder of where speed originally came from. Not data, not systems, but people who refuse to treat limits as fixed. Looking back, these concept cars were never just design exercises. They were cultural snapshots. moments where imagination briefly overtook practicality. And even if most of them never reached production, they still shaped everything that came after. Because the automotive world does not move in straight lines, it moves in ideas. And sometimes those ideas arrive decades before reality is ready for them. That's why these cars still matter. Not because they represent what was built, but because they represent what was once believed possible. And in many ways, that's more important. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe for more automotive rabbit holes involving underrated classics, JDM legends, engineering obsessions, and occasional examples of manufacturers briefly deciding that moderation was optional. There is a lot more where this came from.